Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban from the Lean Blog. This is episode number 13 of the podcast. It is December 17th, 2006. This is part 2 of our discussion with Jim Womack, talking about the state of lean in China. This week we'll talk about more just general manufacturing and business issues related to competing with China, doing business in China, considering doing manufacturing in China either for export or the domestic market. If you have any comments or feedback about the podcast, you can contact me through our website, leanblog.org or leanpodcast.org. Thanks for listening. We talk about whether it's state-owned businesses or companies that are trying to be a little more market-driven. Do you get a sense of, as companies are adopting, again, what you might call Western management practices, is there, kind of a real fanatical short-term focus, or, for whatever reason or another, are some of the Chinese companies being able to take more of a long view sense of some of their decisions and priorities?
Well, it's interesting. The long view of the state industries is they've got to stop being state industries. Mm-hmm. So that, again, totally unknown to, Americans, there's been a tremendous amount of job cutting in the state industries. And when your job gets cut, you lose everything. Yeah. You lose your health plan, you lose your education, you lose your housing. Last year I was talking to the chairman of one of the mid-sized state industries. He only had 400,000 employees. And I thought he was hardly anything. Wow. And I asked him what he'd been doing, and he said, I'm getting rid of the school, getting rid of the hospitals, getting rid of the what they call the Iron Rice Bowl. And I'm getting rid of headcount as fast as I can. So here you have somebody whose actual focus is just on getting rid of people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in the old days, that was the exact opposite of what any manager would think about doing, because you were actually rewarded for finding anything for people to do. Yeah. So now we get the whole system running backwards. And what that means, though, is that, looking at the long term, well, that comes after you get through the downsizing and the de-integration. And by the way, this guy had been making many of his own parts, and all of that, of course, is now being sold off, outsourced, and so forth, the same sort of thing that's gone along in Western countries over the last 30, 40 years. So that he was furiously just trying to get to what he viewed as a minimum competitive condition, mm-hmm. in which his company sort of looked like, what should we call it, a modern mass producer. Yeah. So that was his idea of the long term, was I've got maybe 2 years to get from where I am to being a modern mass producer. And while this fellow had read a few books and had heard obviously about Toyota, mm-hmm. he was not in the automotive industry, but, that was really not, on his radar.
So it sounds like
he was just trying to deal with how you get from the state-controlled job-generating mindset to something that's sort of a market mindset. And the perception was we got to go fast because our state funding is getting cut and so forth, and that's what we got to do. Now, flip it around and you say, well, what about the multinational types that are coming in? Are they building for the long term? And the answer is, well, the smart ones are, and they're also building for the domestic market. But, there's an awful lot of, let's put a plant in there and just see how it goes. And if it works, we'll build another one. And if it doesn't, well, we're off to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So that, would you think that, the bulk probably of forward direct inward investment is long-term oriented? And the answer is sure, some of it is. But much of it is just exploratory. And the sense I think you'd find in most people who are investing is that you don't know how stable the country is, you don't know how stable the currency is. Mm-hmm. So that anyone coming in with a 50-year plan, I think really has to be deeply focused on the domestic market. Yeah. If you're coming in just as an exporter, well then, all kinds of things can happen. Right. And an awful lot of this mm-hmm. labor-intensive, just kind of light assembly kind of stuff, all you need is a slab and a roof and some machines that can be put in a truck. And so, if it works out here, great. If it doesn't, well, we're off to Vietnam. Yeah. So that those folks planning for the long term, well, I don't think so.
And you used a phrase, iron rice bowl. What do you mean, or is that a common phrase?
That's a common phrase. It's just your job, which is to say your source of income, which is to say your source of food, came with good and bad. That it came with housing, it came with education, it came with medical care, such as it was. It all came as a package, because the key to the social control mechanism was the workplace. So that you had your papers that said you worked at Widget Factory number 9.
Yeah.
And everything came with that. And by the way, if you're working at Widget Factory number 9, and at least they do have a school and they do have a hospital and they do have housing, the last thing you want to do is get anybody upset with you at Widget Factory number 9.
Right.
So it is, sort of the ultimate in social control. And that now is, as I say, is really basically being turned upside down.
Right.
And, Americans, I think, just don't have, or, most outsiders, any grasp about just how much dislocation is going on in people's lives in China, that all, again, Americans and Europeans tend to see is these people who work for very low wages. And end of discussion. Well, they're people too.
Right.
And their lives have really been turned upside down in the last 20 years. And, there are just hundreds of millions of people who have moved from rural villages that the family may have been in for centuries into, vast collections of strangers down on the coast. So it's very, there's an awful lot going on there.
Yeah, I mean, you hear stories of people, and oftentimes it's women coming from the inland rural towns to the factory towns, and you talk about the housing and everything is self-contained, and there was a report. I mean, I think one example, it was a London paper. I think it was probably somewhat sensationalized and maybe overblown, but talking about what they described as sweatshop conditions at the iPod factory. A lot of people may be listening to this on an iPod right now. And there were concerns about people being forced to work really long hours and not quite calling it a prison, but if that conditions weren't good for people. Did you? I mean, what do you see in your travels over there?
Well, first off, the plants that are directly run by the multinationals, and particularly the Western multinationals, in my experience, are very clean, very safe, very everything right. Okay? Yeah. And that's partly because they don't know how to run a sweatshop. Go to a manager from Bosch or from Delphi or from Aishinseki and tell them, okay, we want you to go to China and run a sweatshop. And literally, you wouldn't know how to do it.
Right.
You mean take all of the protection off the machinery? You mean throw away the mop, don't clean the floor? You mean turn the heat up in the summer and down in the winter? Let me see if I got this straight. So therefore, what you see in terms of abusive conditions, the worst are independent Chinese-owned operations. Okay? And then you have a lot of contractor stuff, because the iPod thing, I don't know a thing about it, but the point is that's some local contractor.
Yeah, I mean, it's Foxconn, which is a very large Chinese contract manufacturer.
So therefore, the folks who are making stuff for multinationals but are not actually directly under control of multinationals obviously are tempted to cut corners. Now, the thing I always find sad about the corner cutting is that it doesn't actually save you any money, because there's always a quality implication of trying to get people to work too hard in unsafe conditions. I mean, really, how are you going to make quality product? And the answer is you can't.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's kind of pathetic, what I put in the category of stupid meanness, in which by virtue of being mean to your employees for the long term, those managers are just undercutting their own business.
Oh, sure.
And yet in the short term, there is, if the customer is actually not quality sensitive and you can get away with it, well, in the very short term, you just don't know any better. You can see that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I was just when I was over walking through the pencil factory, was just kind of staggered at for example, they were varnishing pencils, and just big open vats of varnish with a dip rail running through. So that I thought if I had gotten out a lighter or match, don't smoke, but I thought I could have blown the whole thing away.
Yeah.
And here are people standing here hour after hour. Well, I mean, how stupid. Half the varnish, which is probably the most expensive thing in the whole operation, is evaporating. You're just looking at them and saying, good Lord, what kind of, doorknobs are you guys? Which is what I told them. So again, I just see a lot of stupid meanness, and that's not right. And I have, sympathy with anybody who on this side of the ocean wants to make a a campaign for saying we ought to have safe work practices everywhere. We ought to. But I think just to be cynical about it for a minute, there is this notion that if we were to enforce safe work practices, the cost would go up. And my view is that, in fact, if you enforce safe work practices, that likely cost wouldn't change at all, and it might go down. Again, just a final observation of the pencil factory, that almost all these were machines that were making pencils, but there were an awful lot of people in there, and almost all of them were either doing material movement, which you can understand has to be done, or they were doing sorting, and basically just culling out the good from the bad.
Yeah.
I mean, there were probably 1,000 people in this factory who spent the whole day looking and sorting. And, of course, the capability of their sort process was, just sort of zero sigma. The thing goes flying by, who knows whether you catch it or not.
Yeah.
So I thought, gee, what a sad thing that if you actually just had some minimum quality processes in here, you would actually cut a lot of cost out. And so therefore, I think it's a bit naive to think that if we basically made every factory in the world safe and clean, that it would affect this, tidal wave of cheap goods that have come into the advanced countries.
Right. And if anything, it sounds like got to convince people that maybe are running unsafe factories in China that it's in their own economic interest to try to turn that around. If you believe quality is free, I guess hope safety is free.
Quality is free. Safety ought to be free. If you know what you're doing. And it's just, I look at this stuff, and first it just makes me very angry. And then I talk to the managers, and, these are people like me. They're not evil ogres. They really don't know any better. They're quite insensitive, and what they tell you is, this is better than the factory I used to work in.
Sure.
And you think, God, I don't want to go to that one. So there you have it. By the way, the aside on that, something that is going to slow down the train a little bit is that the environmental conditions, specifically with regard to air quality, but also water. They're running in the north, running out of water because they've just been tapping into the aquifer underneath to run the agricultural system, and the water level's just dropping steadily. And then everywhere on the coast, the pollution is at a level that people in Europe and the States and Japan just can't imagine. It just really, you can't see across the street on a day when the coal smoke descends. And so they're going to have to spend some money on that. There was a recent report by the Environmental Ministry saying that of the 10% GNP growth that they have every year, their belief was that 3% of that is for health care and aid to agriculture that deals with the other 7%. So that, and look, everybody now understands that. You see it everywhere in the media that there is this realization that the free ride is sort of over, where they could go in and have no emission controls and just let her rip, and where the solution to pollution was dilution. And that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
So that's another dimension where, the air quality is so bad that your kids aren't going to grow properly. And when you get to that point, well, almost anybody says, gee, wait a minute, let's stop and think about this. And so, over the next 10 years, they're going to have to spend a lot of money. And it probably really starts with the Olympics in 2008, that they've pledged to make Beijing smog-free for the Olympics. And, okay, you just send everybody out of town and don't let anybody do anything but walk, and you could get away with that for 3 weeks. But the truth is they've got to go put scrubbers on the power plants, and they've got to make sure that people aren't taking emission controls off cars and selling them for the precious metals, and so forth. So that's suddenly going to be a big thing. And look, it's all advanced economies have started the way China started. That the original thing was the satanic mills of England, the Midlands, where initially it's just pretty awful, it's dangerous, it's dirty, there's pollution. And then over time, as people get rather more toward a middle-class standard, they say, gee, there's more to life than breathing this crud.
Yeah.
And then you have to go spend a lot of money on social things that they've not done. By the way, the other thing about China that I think now there's growing awareness of it, but because of the one-child policy, they're facing a demographic curve that's just like the one that we have with the boomers in the States, in which you're going to end up with a retired generation that's actually much larger than the working generation. And same thing, of course, in Japan and in Europe and the States. But we think of China as this young, exuberant country, Whereas, in fact, they've done all of us a favor. You might not approve of the methods, but they've done all the rest of us a favor by really putting the clamp on population growth.
Right.
But there is a one-time transitional problem that goes with that. And so you look at the environmental problems they're facing, and you look at the demographic situation, and you can see why they have sort of wanted to pull all the stops out and just see how far they could get on this course before changing course, because it's going to be mean they're going to have to grow a lot slower. Mm-hmm. And then that gets them very, very scared about social stability.
Right.
All those folks out in the country are living worse than the folks in town, or they wouldn't be coming to town. Mm-hmm. Okay, when you want to talk about dangerous factories, go out and look out how people are living on the farm, and it's not a very nice place.
Do you have any maybe as some final thoughts? You've talked to people before, sent out the emails,
mm-hmm.
The phrase, doing the lean math comes to mind as far as, people are considering, outsourcing to China. Is that math shifting at all, or, do you have pretty much the same advice?
Well, no, I would put, this is like TSA and the threat level. I would say that anybody at this point who's going to China purely for the purpose of exporting back to the U.S. or Europe really ought to do some careful analysis of the risk factors. And they're really obvious risk factors that you've got country stability. And just for the moment, despite all of the protests, and there's an enormous amount of just below the radar protests going on of all kinds of shenanigans being done by crooked local officials and so on. But China itself is probably fairly stable as a country for a while. But when you say how stable is the currency, that's both ours and theirs. Well, we're getting ever closer to the day of reckoning on that. And then you say how stable, particularly if you're going to do it through suppliers, how stable do you think those suppliers are, both with regard to they're going to be in business when you need them, and with regard to the fact that they're going to go into business against you. Now, look, anybody can reverse engineer. They don't have to be working for you to reverse engineer. They just buy your product and reverse engineer it. But the fact is you are helping them along. But you're going to reduce their time to market if they have direct first-hand experience of making your product. So it just seems to me that the risk factors have gone up. And so if I were thinking right now about moving operations from Europe, the U.S., Japan to China for export, entirely for export back to these markets, I would say, gee, maybe that train's already left the station. If, on the other hand, you are trying to run a global business and you reckon you want a substantial presence in the Chinese market, well, then it seems to me you probably ought to think about going to China. So I would say the math has shifted further in the direction of think 3 times before you really do this. And, of course, I'm well known for saying for North America, what's wrong with Mexico? If you really can't fix your business and you just aren't cost competitive, well, I guess you got to do something. But, gosh, Mexico is a truck location as opposed to a boat location or air freight. And ditto for Eastern Europe, Western Europe. Just kind of baffled as to why people would go all the way to the other side of the world when you can get 90% just of the, on the face of it, benefit from going south rather than going east. Or in Europe's case, going east rather than going far east. And so I just continue to scratch my head at what appears to me to be pretty daffy analysis by most people who are making these kinds of decisions.
Well, I'm tempted to ask then. There were some reports in the news that General Motors was considering actually building some cars in China for export back to the U.S. And I think the guy that used to run Yugo is talking about importing cars. Is that daffy, or is that a step of, is that a kind of a precursor to where, a Chinese automaker might pull a Toyota, if you will, and set up, develop a brand and set up shop here in the U.S. to be closer to American customers?
Well, it's, GM does have joint ventures in China, and they're making small cars, very small cars in China, smaller than the American market seems to want, even with current, this recent energy blip.
Right.
So sure, they could bring cars from China. Most of what would make sense to bring here is product that's just currently not on sale here. So it would be a bottom of the market range extender. But look, my expectation on that is that not as much as you might think is going to happen as quickly as you might think. That the Chinese companies are now pulling back. That this deal with Brooklyn to sell cars in the States seems to have always be 2 years away from actually happening. Phil Murtaugh is a terrific guy who was head of GM China and then lost out in the race to the top at GM and is now the strategy director for SAIC, that's Shanghai Auto Industry Corporation. Actually just announced a couple of days ago that they are not coming to the States, that they've thought about it and just concluded that they will be very busy, thank you very much, in China for some years to come, and it's just not, what's the point? That the Japanese at this point did not, talking about the independent Chinese companies, they're a long ways away from where the Japanese were when they started coming to the States, in the mid-60s. And Toyota tried prematurely, most people have forgotten, came to the States in 57, 58, and it was an utter fiasco. And then Yugo, which was another, foreign-owned, do-it-ourselves grassroots thing, was a catastrophe. And the initial wave of Korean product, there was a big boom in cheap Korean cars in the 80s, and then it all collapsed in the 90s. And it's only now that Hyundai's gotten back to where they were, 10 years ago. So the problem with cars is that it's an incredibly mature product, and there is this magic line between what's a car and what isn't a car. And that line keeps getting higher, that almost any delivered defects now are just unacceptable. That you look at the whole range of what's out in the market, and it's about 1.5 defects per car as Power judges it, and these are mostly very trivial defects. So that to show up with a vehicle with 10 defects, and by the way, not much durability, at a $6,000 selling price, will attract a few people. There are always a few people who just don't have any brains and will buy something that just has a low sticker price. And then you discover it has no resale value. And by the way, you discover it won't go more than about 30,000 miles. And so look, there are bound to be a few of those that come along. But I think Chinese are probably 10 to 15 years away from significantly challenging the market here. And again, if you want to build cheap cars for the States and you really need a car that is entirely in a cheap currency, well, I mean, good grief, go to Mexico. I just am skeptical that you're going to see the big Chinese invasion that a lot of people seem to be bracing themselves for. And by the way, just a final thing, by the time you could really get it together to try to ship a lot of cars from China to the States, I'm just certain that the exchange rate is going to shift very dramatically, or there's going to be trade management. So that, I don't know, I think you're crazy to give it a go. That's where we are. Okay.
Well, I really appreciate your time and sharing your insights on what you've been seeing in regards to lean in China. It's been really interesting to hear about. So I really do appreciate you being here and joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, well, let me just say one other thing that just so people will understand that I say we are equal opportunity educators here at the Lean Institute, and we have actually, there are 12 Lean Institutes around the world. We will teach anybody who wants to know. And I say may that company in wherever that is the best student and does the most things right win. I really, truly do think competition is good for people. So we view ourselves as having a Chinese institute for the long haul, but with very modest expectations about the amount of uptake we're going to have in the short term. And so therefore, it seems to me that's probably kind of a good metaphor in China generally. Great expectations for the long haul. I do believe they will build a first-class economy. And by the way, I believe that for the most part we'll be better off for their doing so. That the one thing economists really, I think, do have right is comparative advantage, as figured out by David Ricardo 200 years ago. And actually, for the Chinese to run a brilliant economy is actually going to be better for the world than for them to run a crummy economy. But I also understand that the man on the street, the woman on the street, just has a hard time quite getting their head around that. And this is going to be a very long march. So we'll see how it all turns out.
Okay. Well, thanks again. I certainly appreciate your time and your insights.
Sure. Anytime.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.